Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, July 17th, 2020. Assisted suicide. According to the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, the definition of suicide is 1. The act or an instance of taking one's own life voluntarily and intentionally, or 2. The ruin of one's own interests. The same dictionary defines assisted as to give supplementary support or aid to. Now, while suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, many people think of assisted suicide only in the first meaning. Until recently, in almost every state, assisting someone in taking their own life was a crime, and the punishments were severe. Some states are now passing legislation that allows a person to end their life by having a physician give them a lethal injection. However, all of us have known people who committed financial suicide either by reckless spending or by unwise investing. In fact, some of the people who commit actual suicide by taking their own lives are motivated by the effects of financial suicide or the ruin of their own interests. For some who ruin their own interests, they are assisted by alcohol or drugs. Others are assisted by greed or a willingness to break the law, but the result is always the same, a ruin of their financial interests. Throughout history, great civilizations have formed, existed for varying amounts of time, and then declined to where they either vanished entirely or became much less dominant and powerful. So just why did these great civilizations decline? Well, there are many reasons for it, but in all cases, their citizens and inhabitants just stopped supporting their governments. In some cases, citizens cripple their government by evading taxes to the point that the government didn't have enough funding to operate. In others, citizens refused to obey the laws and society just degenerated into anarchy. And in still others, citizens refused to join in the fight against invading enemies who eventually overwhelmed them. Now, of course, there was always the more direct way, an armed rebellion where the citizenry rose up and overthrew the existing government. Prior to the French Revolution, the French government became more and more corrupt. It kept assessing higher and higher taxes on the fewer and fewer people who were creating the products and services that the country needed. People eventually realized that the only people who actually paid those taxes were the ones who could not bribe the government. Sound familiar? Well, eventually the taxes became so oppressive that the people began to starve because they couldn't pay their taxes and feed their families. Now, at that point, they revolted, and many of the nobles and government officials of the day literally lost their heads. In Russia, the corruption and perceived contempt for the people led to the overthrow of the Tsar and the rise of communism. It seems that, like today, the ruling classes in those countries openly manipulated their tax systems for the benefit of those who could pay for favorable treatment. Now, maybe they were careful at first to appear to have the people's best interests at heart, but after a time they dropped any pretense of doing what was best for the people and did only what was best for themselves and their well-connected friends. The ruling class in this country and their minions in D.C. are now at that point. They've dropped any pretense of doing what's best for the people and are now openly operating solely in their own best interests. They flagrantly boast that they were the ones who wrote a myriad of incomprehensible laws, with the crown jewel being the Infernal Revenue Code. And they're now commanding exorbitant amounts of money to help people avoid the negative impact of the laws they drafted or to purchase exemptions from those laws. The net effect is that the ruling class and their friends are protected, while the brunt of all those laws falls heavily on all the rest of us. Now, it's easy to focus attention on the politicians who took bribes. Even the ruling class will attack those politicians, not necessarily because they took the bribes, but because they got caught. Now, they know that there are so many other ways that you can get so much more money without violating any laws that they know taking a bribe is just a pretty stupid thing to do. So let's look at the income tax and assisted suicide. The income tax is based on the principle that the more a person has, the more he should pay. The idea is that those who have more should pay more so that everyone can have the government services that we all need and demand. Now, that in itself is not a new concept. Almost all of the taxes throughout history have been based on the idea that taxes should be proportional to the value of what's being taxed. A tax on crops, for example, was often based on the size of the crops. One farmer who produced 100 bushels and paid 3 bushels in tax paid less than the farmer who produced 1,000 bushels and paid 30 bushels in tax. Property taxes are based on the value of the property. If you have a large, expensive home, then you will pay more in property tax than your neighbor whose home is less extravagant. The amount of fair tax is based on the amount of the purchase. Now, obviously, 23% of $100 is less than 23% of $1,000. However, unlike almost all of the taxes throughout history that people accepted, you don't just pay more if you produce more, you pay a lot more if you produce more, but there's a limit. There is a level at which increasing taxation kills people's incentives to work harder if it means forking over more and more of their increase to a government that they trust less and less. With all the noise coming from D.C. and the media, it's easy to get distracted and not really see clear evidence of just how bad our income payroll tax system really is. Now, one way to look at it is to imagine that you were put in charge of designing a tax system for a brand new country. Your system needs to raise enough money so the government can meet the demand for services, but you also want your system to promote a thriving economy so your people can grow and prosper. Now, you were given a blank sheet of paper and you're free to design your system any way you want. Question: would the tax system that you design require almost all of your country's citizens to spend unproductive hours keeping numerous otherwise unneeded records and to share the intimate details of their personal finances with the government on a tax return? Would it require that the government employ large numbers of bureaucrats and spend billions of dollars processing those tax returns, checking them for accuracy, and making sure that no one's trying to cheat the system? Would it actually encourage cheating and evasion? Would your system allow the government to harass, intimidate, and seize the property of innocent individuals who have done absolutely nothing wrong? Would it directly punish harder work and savings because as a citizen's earnings and savings increase, they pay an increasingly higher tax rate? Would your system be so complex that nobody could understand it? Would it reward only those citizens who can afford to pay huge amounts for tax advice or make huge contributions to the ruling class and their minions in Congress so that they can pay much less tax than others making the same amount of income? And one last question. Would the tax system you design put your country's businesses at a competitive disadvantage on the world market while at the same time subsidizing their foreign competitors? Now, most people would think you'd lost your ever-loving mind if you proposed such a tax system. But sadly, those statements accurately describe our current income payroll tax system. In conclusion, the ruling class and their minions in D.C. are using the income payroll tax system to assist the economic suicide of all the rest of us, and that has to stop. In his book 1984, George Orwell said, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Now, throughout history, the ruling classes and their minions have always felt that they were the only ones who knew what the people really needed. This arrogance has led them to believe and assert that 2 + 2 equals whatever number furthers their agenda. Now, 2 + 2 actually does equal 4, and it's time for Americans to start taking back control of their lives by wresting away from the ruling class and their minions in D.C. one of their most lucrative sources of income, the selling of federal income tax benefits to the highest bidder, and not being at all concerned about how it adversely affects the rest of us. Now, we deserve and demand that the fair tax become the law of the land and replace the corrupt income payroll tax system. So if you are ready to take a very significant step towards taking control of your government back from a small group of corrupt people and making it possible for all to prosper, go to FAIRtax.org. Watch the whiteboards under How It Works, and then, if you agree, please join us. Then, contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the fair tax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.